A new Amnesty International report accuses Qatar of exploiting workers who are building the venues for the 2022 World Cup.
You cannot have a major sporting event like the World Cup, the world's largest sporting event, happening based, completely built on labor exploitation. That's simply unacceptable.
Amnesty spoke with more than 130 construction workers on a major stadium project. Everyone detailed a list of abuses. There are going to be more stadiums and thousands more foreign workers on the project, so Amnesty says the time for change is now. According to Amnesty International, there are 1.7 million migrant workers in Qatar right now. That makes up over 90% of the workforce. More than 3,000 workers, mostly migrants, work on Khalifa Stadium every day. It's the main site of the 2022 FIFA World Cup. More than 230 men working on that stadium and other venues are abused and exploited, according to the report. Amnesty says some have fallen victim to forced labor. Last hour, I spoke with Mustafa Kadri. He is Amnesty International's Gulf migrants' rights researcher. He was there on the ground for Amnesty in Qatar, speaking to many of the migrants quoted in this report. I asked him to describe what he saw.
We're talking about, ordinary men who have come to Qatar to get a better life for themselves and their families, living in the most appalling, dirty, cramped, filthy conditions, dangerous often, no fire alarms, 8 to 14 men in one room, kitchens and toilets in a really appalling state right next to each other, having their passports confiscated, often having their pay half of what they're promised, amounts like $120, $200, having paid, recruitment fees back home before they came of between $500 to $4,300, so a lot of money for someone earning that little. And then when they complain about their conditions, their employer actually threatens them and says, if you don't stay quiet, there will be consequences. And why we say in some cases this amounts to forced labor is because we had workers clearly who did not want to continue working. And when they complain, their employer says to them, if you do not continue working, you'll be actually charged money, or we will never give back your passport, you will never leave the country, or conversely, we'll actually hand you over to the police as a runaway worker, which is a crime in Qatar, and evicted from the country. And so these are people whose life is literally like a prison. The word used by some of these workers, their life is between appalling accommodation site and working in the hot sun. And of course, until we came around, these people were suffering in silence. So really, when you're talking about 234 people, that's a lot of people. But in fact, as you said, there are thousands of workers on these World Cup sites. How many other workers are suffering in the same way? That's the real concern that we have.
Qatar itself was addressed these concerns because it's not the first time we've heard this. The government pledged to change its sponsorship system, the system that you mentioned, where migrants can't change jobs or leave the country without their employer's permission. What's been done to improve the situation?
There's no question that there have been some improvements. I mean, for example, there is what you mentioned about these changes to the law. Now they have this wage protection system, which is an attempt to, by making all businesses provide payments through electronic means, to track how much workers are paid and whether they're regularly paid. They also changed the sponsorship system. So basically any foreigner who works in Qatar needs to have a sponsor to work in the country. And that sponsor gives them permission to stay in the country, to leave the country, or even change jobs. So it creates this incredible power dynamic. But what we see in Qatar is that basically these changes are really tinkering on the edges. They're not really fundamentally changing, firstly, the power dynamic between a sponsor and a worker, so that if an employee is exploitative, they can literally get away with the worst abuse. So that's one big part of it we don't see really changing. But second to that is Qatar already has some really good protections. For example, forced labor is outlawed, trafficking is outlawed, passport confiscation is outlawed, poor accommodation is outlawed, and yet we see in these cases and many other cases that clearly the law is not being enforced. So whatever Qatar might say, even if you don't agree with Amnesty International's assessment, I think we can all agree the fact is that the abuses we have found shows whatever they are doing and FIFA, their partner, is doing is not working. They're failing all workers in the country.
Who are the sponsors of the World Cup, and what impact might they have on the situation?
It's a really good question. Sponsors are really key to this situation. We can't have sponsors making, many millions, if not billions of dollars in profit and ignoring these issues. The main sponsors are people like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Adidas, Gazprom, the Russian gas giant, Hyundai, Daewoo, the South Korean company, and there's a number of other sponsors and partners of FIFA as well. These groups, we've been in touch with them. They've expressed some concern about the situation and FIFA's failures on human rights. That's really welcome, but in fact we also need to see concrete steps from them, and we can't just see them talking when the spotlight is on. We have 6 years left. Now we need to see action by them and them influencing FIFA to make sure that they actually take the steps to really, number one, in themselves look at what the situation is, tell us publicly what they're doing and make that a regular monitoring system, but then also use their influence with the countries to make sure that Qatar makes the change they need to do. But you're quite right, sponsors, multinationals have a role to play in improving the situation.